So my name is Jeff Walker. I'm the Executive Administrator of the Water Development Board, and I welcome you all to this conference. It's our third, I would say semi-annual, but we kind of had to skip a year in there because of some things that happened. But welcome y'all. We've got a great, I hope you've been able to participate in all the panels today. We've got more to come. The ones I've seen have been fantastic and full, and a lot of good conversations. So today we have our keynote speaker is Warren Berger. So let me start out a little different here. My sister, Rhonda, is a doctorate, and she travels the worldwide. She goes to conferences everywhere, Bangkok, Dubai, she's been everywhere. And so when she tells me that she heard a speaker that blew her away, I listen. And so we were talking a while ago, and she was at a conference in New Orleans about 2 years ago, and she texted me from that conference. She goes, I'm listening to this guy, and he's awesome, just great. And so I said, who is it? And she says, Warren Berger, and the beautiful question. I said, that sounds pretty cool. So I started doing a little investigation. So, he comes highly recommended by my sister, so that's high praise right there. He's a best-selling author and a questionologist, and I'm a big fan of questions. I love questions. I drive my family crazy sometimes. I'm a pre-Google encyclopedia reader. How many people remember encyclopedias? 100 of them across there. Everything in the world. Now it's on your phone. But sometimes we forget to ask the question what we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve a problem, and we forget to ask what's the question we're trying to solve. My CFO does this to me all the time. I'll say, we need to do this. She goes, what are you trying to solve? What's the question? And so it makes me rethink things. So I was thinking the other night, I said, what if we ask different questions? So and 9/11, the people who perpetrated 9/11, what if instead of we're trying to ask, who are they? We're asking, why are they all taking flight lessons? I don't think anybody asked that question. They're trying to figure out who they are. Why don't we ask, why are they taking flight lessons? We try to figure out how to get water to people in western parts of the United States. Why are we asking that instead of why are we building cities in the desert in the first place? So just trying to think different questions. Ask the questions, the bottom line question, things like that. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Warren how to ask better questions and how to be thinking differently. I know in our industry, it's a zero-sum game. You don't want to mess up on water, but we need to be innovative too because there's lots of things coming that we're not ready for, and we need to start thinking about that. So let me introduce Warren Berger.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate the introduction. Have to live up to it now. Well, first of all, how is everyone today? Very good. Okay, so that was a rote question I just asked you, which is a question asked just out of habit. And when you ask rote questions, you tend to get rote answers like, fine. So what I work on is a different kind of questioning. It's not really the rote questions we ask every day, but it's the more kind of thoughtful questions, the more powerful questions, the more breakthrough type questions, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I do call myself a questionologist. I don't know how many people are familiar with that term. I don't see a lot of recognition out there, and the reason may be because I made it up. I've been studying questioning for about 20 years, first as a journalist, where it was sort of a tool of the trade for me. And then I sort of got more into the formal study of it because I realized how powerful it was, not just for journalists or not just for lawyers, but it was a powerful tool for people who were trying to innovate, people who were trying to create, and people who were trying to bring about change. So I got really into the idea that there ought to be a formal study of questions, and there ought to be an ology, if you will, of question. Because we have psychology, we have zoology, we have all these ologies out there, but we don't have anything for questioning. So what I did was I declared myself a questionologist. And I actually did so one day in the pages of the New York Times. I wrote an article and called myself a questionologist. And to my surprise, no one questioned it. So I've been using that that title ever since, and kind of hung out my shingle as a questionologist. And then once I did hang out my shingle, I started to get patients right away coming to see me. And these were some of the people that started coming to me. A lot of big names in business. At one point, the US Army contacted me, and I got really nervous, because what does the US Army want? NASA space program and all these big companies. So why were they contacting me, and why are they interested in questioning? The number one thing that they are interested in that relates to questioning is innovation. There's lots of other good things that questioning can do as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But innovation is probably the main driving reason why people will tend to come to me and ask about questioning. And part of it is maybe because in my books and in my speeches and in my talks, I make this rather bold claim, which is that questioning is the starting point of innovation. And so where does that come from? Where does that idea come from? Well, when I began doing deep research on questioning, what I started doing is I started looking at all these innovations through the years. I started tracing them back to their origins. So you would take something like Airbnb, it's like, well, how did Airbnb actually come about? And I would trace it back to, when the founders were first starting the company. And what I would discover in so many cases was that they were starting with a question. In the case of Airbnb, it was like they were asking, why is it that so many people in our city can't get a hotel room? And at the same time, we know all these people who have an extra room in their house, or an extra apartment, or an extra sofa bed. And why hasn't someone connected these two things together? So that was the question they were working on at the outset. And the same thing with all these other breakthroughs. The cell phone started with a question, internet, the Olympics, the founder of the Olympics, whose name escapes me right now, but he started with a question of, what if we could create a way for countries to compete on the sports field instead of on the battlefield? And so there are all these fascinating questions that tend to that have led to these big breakthroughs. But I don't want to suggest that questioning is just about breakthroughs. Oh, by the way, before I get into that, let me just take. I always like to tell one story out of these sort of startup stories, these stories of questions that led to some type of a breakthrough. And there's lots of stories in my book, but there's one story that I really, really like. And I have to warn you, it's a little weird. And that's probably why I like it. So it's because the question involved is a really weird question. Okay, and I'm going to share the question with you now. This is a question that a college football coach down at the University of Florida asked back in the mid-'60s. And the reason he asked it is he noticed that his players were drinking a lot of water. Notice I brought water into the conversation here. They were drinking a lot of water on the sidelines, but they were still getting dehydrated. They weren't having to go to the bathroom, and they were getting dehydrated. And so he was wondering, well, what's going on here? So he did what every good questioner should do. Not only did he observe and ask why, but he shared his question. And that's really important. In this case, he shared his question with a professor at the university and a professor of renal biology, something to do with the kidneys. And the professor said to him, oh, well, yeah, the reason why this is happening is because the players are sweating so much that they can't replace their fluids just by drinking water. So the coach said, okay, that's interesting. And then the coach kind of goes off on his own, and now the professor starts to get interested in this question. And the professor takes it from a why question to a what if, and he starts asking, what if we could somehow come up with a liquid that actually replaced the fluids better than water? He goes to work on this in the laboratory at the university, and next thing you know, he shows up with a bottle of strange colored liquid. He takes it to the coach, and he says to the coach, Coach, I think we might have something here. And the coach says, well, I'm not going to try it. He goes, let's try it on the players. But being a smart coach, he tried it on the practice squad, not on the starters. And the practice squad had a great day. They didn't get dehydrated. And the end result was they realized they had something, and this became Gatorade, which they named after their football team, the Florida Gators. And it became a product that they developed and then rolled out, and of course it's now hugely successful. So I love this story because it shows you that a beautiful question can take a lot of different forms, including weird forms. But the key thing is you have to sort of take that question and you have to share it, and then you have to begin to act on it. And so that's one of the key things. I'll come back to that point as we talk. Another thing I want to say is that questioning is not just about, coming up with new products or creating something, a Silicon Valley type startup. It's not just about that. It's about the kind of issues that I know you guys are dealing with on a regular basis. So what questioning it can do is it can help you to problem solve, okay? It can also help you to anticipate problems that haven't happened yet, or anticipate issues that may come up, which I know is a big thing in your field. And it can help you adapt to change. And for these reasons, it's really, really popular with people across industries, and I think it's really relevant to what you guys do. And I think what I'm going to try to do today is give you a couple of tools, really basic tools and takeaways that you can start using. And maybe you can even use it at the conference, because actually conferences are a great time to ask questions. They're a great time to use your questioning skills. So, okay, so let's start with how do you become a better questioner? Okay, so I've been thinking about this for a long time, right? Obviously, it's a central issue. And one of the thoughts I had was, one of the epiphanies I had was, well, what if you could study the all-time greatest questioners and look at how they ask questions and what they do, and what could you learn from the techniques of the greatest all-time questioners, the GOAT of questioning, if you will, the greatest of all time. So then I had to figure out, okay, well, who is the greatest all-time questioner? And I was starting with Steve Jobs at one point. I was looking at him. This is something Steve Jobs said, which I think is really interesting. Someone asked him, what's the most important thing you learned about running a business, about running Apple? And he said that one of the most important things I found was, if I went around the company and I asked everyone, why are we doing this thing we're doing? It got amazing results. So he would go to the shipping department. Why do we use this particular approach to shipping? Why are we doing this in the marketing department? It would challenge people to step back and think about why they were using the methods they were using, and he found that really, really valuable. So Jobs for a while was a leading contender as my GOAT of questioning, but ultimately I decided he was not the GOAT. I, of course, thought a lot about Einstein. Einstein once said, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would spend the first 55 minutes making sure I was asking the right question. Because Einstein understood if you're working on the wrong question, you're ultimately going to waste your time. And so Einstein talked about questioning all the time. I think he would, I dare say he would agree with a lot of what I am going to tell you today. But nevertheless, I did not settle on Einstein as the greatest questioner of all time. Now, I also looked at artists, I looked at engineers, I looked at people of all disciplines. Interestingly, one discipline that I found is really good at questioning is comedians. Comedians are amazing questioners. And so in particular, I happen to have a favorite comedian who is the late George Carlin. And George Carlin used to ask questions like this one. And so, and all of his work was really rooted in questioning. So what he did, and what lots of you may notice this if you start to like pay attention to this now when you're watching comedians, what the best ones do is they look at all the weird stuff we do as human beings and they question it. And so a lot of their routines are based on, why do we do this crazy stuff we do? And so comedians are great questioners, but ultimately, even though I love George Carlin, I decided he's not the goat of questioning. So I had all these contenders, and there you see Oprah Winfrey. I like her because she once a year, Oprah Winfrey devotes a whole issue of her magazine to asking questions. You see Neil deGrasse Tyson is up there. You see Marie Curie is up there. You see Picasso, a great artist. You see Socrates down in the lower right-hand corner. And in the middle is the greatest questioner of all time. Anybody want to hazard a guess on who I settled on as the greatest questioner of all time? A child. Okay. But specifically, a 4-year-old girl. A 4-year-old girl is the ultimate questioning machine. This has been borne out by research. The 4-year-old boy is not far behind. He's asking tons of questions as well, but the 4-year-old girl is slightly ahead. One study had the 4-year-old girl asking 300 questions a day. Many of them directed at her mom. This was a British study, so it's her mom. And in the study, they even commented on, why does the mother get so many questions? And they said the reason is because when the child asks the father, he says, go ask your mother. So this can be an interesting phenomenon, because what happens is, when you're getting 300 questions a day, it can be rather exhausting. And so a lot of times people are almost wishing that the questioning would ease up and stop. But, be careful what you wish for, because what we find is that this is actually a peak period of questioning, and what starts to happen after this is that questioning starts to decline, and it actually declines pretty rapidly for a lot of kids. So it's a kind of an interesting situation. I think I talk to schools a lot about this, and we talk about what can you do to get kids asking more questions in class, and why do they ask less questions as they go through school? And there's all kinds of factors involved. I've tried to isolate what are some of the things causing it, and a lot of it is peer pressure. Whereas when they were at home and they were 4 years old, they had no problem asking questions, but when they're surrounded by other kids, it's a different situation. There's various reasons. When I think about the forces conspiring against questioning, interestingly, one is knowledge. When you're a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, you are like a blank slate, so you don't bring any knowledge, so you're asking questions like crazy. As we start to develop knowledge, we start to think we know stuff, and so we ask less. So in an interesting way, knowledge can be a force against questioning. But also fear. Fear is probably the biggest thing. Kids are, and adults too, are nervous about asking a question. What if I ask the wrong question? Am I revealing something by asking a question that I don't know? Am I revealing that I'm stupid? Am I wasting time? So there's all this fear associated with questioning. And then also time. I'll talk more about time later, but questioning takes time. And oftentimes when you're in a rushed situation, whether it's a workplace or whether it's a schoolroom, there isn't time for questions. Questions get sort of squeezed out. And then too, there's the fact that in school, we get rewarded for our answers. We don't really get rewarded for the questions we ask. So kids pick up on that. They figure out, okay, I'm not getting rewarded for this thing, so I'm not going to do it. And so these are things we kind of need to be aware of. And I'm going to talk about that. Before I do, does anyone have any questions at this point or at this stage? It's always good for a questionologist to stop talking every once in a while and just ask if there are any questions. So I think we can take one or two, and then I'm going to move back in. There's a question back here. We might want to bring a mic to you before you ask your question.
My question was, is that 4-year-old greatest questioner your daughter?
It can be any 4-year-old. I have noticed within my family that they're questions are particularly strong. I think when I was 4 years old, I was asking more than 300 questions a day, if I remember correctly. But of course, no one was keeping count. But yeah, it's pretty much a universal phenomenon, which is really interesting. You know, why does it happen? Why is it? It's just because there are things going on in your brain at that point that are just, your synapses are firing. You're in this intense learning mode when you're 4 or 5 years old, and you don't have any inhibitions about asking questions. Anything goes. You're willing to ask anything. You're willing to ask the most basic question. You don't have any fear of that. So it's a very interesting time, and I'm going to kind of come back to that actually with this next part of the talk. And if there are other questions, that we can get to them at the end. So how do you deal with these forces? Well, I'm going to start with this. We've done that already. So I'm going to start with this. So this is, this is actually, might sound sort of fanciful, you know, you're an adult, how are you going to release your inner 4-year-old? But actually, there have been studies done on this, and there have been studies that say it is possible for adults to act more like children. We may know adults that do that, in fact. But it is possible to pick up some of the behaviors, to model some of the behaviors. There have been studies done that show that if you make the effort to do so, you can pick up some of the behaviors of kids. And I think this is known as neoteny. There's actually a scientific term for this, which is the retention of childlike attributes in adulthood. Now, when we do neoteny, when we are attempting to be more childlike in our approaches, what are we going to try to do? What are we going to try to imitate? Well, the most important thing we can do to imitate, you know, the childlike questioning behavior is to try to see things with a fresh eye and then ask why. Okay? It's a pretty basic thing. It goes back to what I was saying with Steve Jobs, right? When Steve Jobs talked about going around the company and asking everyone to, you know, to answer the question, why are we doing it this way? We can all do this within our daily lives, within our work. It really just takes the effort to do it. You know, it takes the effort to sort of say, I'm going to try to look at this situation as if I haven't seen it before. As if, even though I may have gone through this process many times, we've been doing something a certain way for the last 10 years, there's a whole process involved, I am going to try to look at it as if I'm new to this. I've never seen it before. And that, when you do that, you're bringing that childlike naivety to a situation or a problem, and it's extremely valuable. And then when you do that, it will automatically fire why questions. You will, when you look at something from a naive viewpoint, you will almost automatically begin to ask why. You'll say, that's interesting. You know, we've been doing it that way, but have we thought about why we're really doing it that way? And so it's kind of a natural flow that happens. Now, this is really important, asking why. I mentioned earlier, a lot of innovations, they start with why, but it doesn't end with why. Okay, why is just the starting point. In fact, I like to say that if you keep asking why, what you end up with is kind of a circular thing where it's more like philosophy, right? If you're just asking why, you're not really getting anything done, and you're more like in a philosophical mode. So questioning minus action, to me, is philosophy. Philosophers always yell at me when I do this, when I say this. But you know, I just mean it becomes a thing that's not really useful in business, because it's about asking why, and having long discussions and never getting anywhere. So one of the things you have to do with questioning is you have to bring action to your questioning. So you can't just ask why, you have to progress from why to what if to how. And this is an interesting sequence of questioning that I kind of developed after studying innovators and great questioners. I kind of found that they went through a cycle. They went through an interesting cycle of questioning that often started with why, but it didn't end there. And these three types of questions are really interesting in that they complement each other and they work together. So if you look at why, what if, and how, what are these three question stems doing? These are big, open-ended question stems. Okay, so when you ask why, you're trying to understand a problem. Okay, why is this happening? Why does this situation exist? You're trying to get a handle on it. Now then you want to move to what if, which is kind of where you begin to use your imagination to say, okay, I understand why there's a problem, but what if we tried to come at it this way? What if we tried a different approach? So now you're using your imagination to sort of change reality a little bit, to speculate, okay? And then ultimately, to be a successful questioner or innovator, you want to end up with how, because how is where the rubber meets the road. How is when you begin to get more practical and you say, okay, we've gone through these what if scenarios, but how are we going to actually get something done, and how much is it going to cost, and how much time is it going to take? So you want to end up at how, and this is a really interesting kind of framework to just keep in your back pocket. You know, you can apply it to almost anything. You know, it's like I've said to people, if you're trying to decide whether to move to another city, you can go through the why, what if, how framework about why might I want to move? Why am I even thinking about this? And then what if I tried this? And how am I going to actually make it happen? So it's a very practical kind of way to come at the idea of using questioning to understand and then address any kind of problem. In order to do this kind of stuff, it's important to say that you need to make time for questioning. So if you're going to do more questioning on your own, or if you're going to try to do more questioning in a group, let's say you're part of an organization or part of some type of a group that's working on challenges, you have to sort of dedicate time for questioning. Now, a lot of times we're reluctant to do this. And I'm going to return to my friend George Carlin again, because he made an interesting point once about this idea of time and questioning. George Carlin said once, some people see things that are and ask why. Some people dream of things that never were and ask why not. Some people have to go to work and don't have time for all that shit. So the point George Carlin is making there is interesting. It's not really true for him, of course. He was a great questioner. He asked why and why not all the time. But you know, it's interesting that we tend to think, gee, there's no time for questioning. So what I will say there about that is up to us, all of us, to decide whether there is time for us to make time for questioning. It's true of every teacher in every classroom. It's true of every manager in every company. It's true of anyone working within any group or organization. Do you think it's important enough to ask questions to set aside time to actually do it? Because we make time for the things that matter to us. And so I think that's a key point. You know, you need to say, on Mondays, we're going to have question day, or we're going to have meetings that we're going to work on with questioning. You can do exercises around questioning. This is something that I share with teachers in classrooms, but I also have done this at companies. And you can get people into groups, and there's an exercise you can do, which I will share with you in the takeaways. I'll show you, you'll have a way to do this if you want to try it. But there are exercises you can do where you just ask questions and you work your questioning muscles and you learn how to make your questions better. And so you can do this stuff, but you know, you have to say, okay, I'm carving out the time to actually do this because I think it's important. So as you're working on your questions, keep in mind that tone is very important. So when you're doing question exercises like this one, you might be trying to generate as many questions as possible, generate the most creative questions you can. But one of the things we often lose sight of is that the way you ask a question matters almost as much as the questions you actually ask. So how do you ask questions in the right way? And what happens if you ask questions in the wrong way? If you ask questions, and let's go back to those why questions, right? Why are we doing things the way we're doing them? You ask that question in the wrong way, people are going to take it the wrong way. They're going to think of it as you're challenging them, you're being confrontational, you're being judgmental. Okay, so one of the things I say to people is that when you're asking questions, you always have to have a balance between humility and curiosity. Okay, so you have to indicate to people you're not judging them, you're not being a wise guy. You are asking a question because you're genuinely curious about it, and so you do it with a lot of humility. And how do you do that? It can be as simple as instead of saying, why are we doing it this way? Saying, I've been wondering about something. I see that we're using this approach, and I'm wondering why we took that, or what led us to take that approach. Now, if you really want to soften it, you might even add a rationale onto the end of it, where you say, and the reason I'm asking this question is because, in my job, sometimes this affects me, and so forth. So what you're doing is you're doing this kind of introduction, where you say, I'm asking out of curiosity, and then you end with a rationale, where you say, this is why I'm asking you the question. What that does is it takes away a lot of the judgment that can be involved with questions, and a lot of the defensiveness that you might get from the person on the other end of the question. So keep that in mind. In short, don't be a question jerk. When people ask questions oftentimes that aren't really questions, they're sort of veiled criticism, like, what were you thinking? Or, don't you realize how important this project is? So don't use questions to berate people. Don't use questions to second guess them. Don't use questions to be a naysayer like this guy. Haven't we tried this already? So use them in a kind of a positive way. There's a term called appreciative inquiry that some of you may have heard, but it's a whole study of asking questions in a positive way. But it can be summed up as simply try to ask questions in a way that are not accusatory, like who caused this problem. Try to ask them in a way that builds positivity into the questioning. Okay, so one more tip I want to give you, and that is embrace the power of how might we. Questioning is really powerful when you share it with other people and when you work on questions together. This little question stem is actually super powerful and super effective. It's being used by Google and Facebook and all these companies, and it's really caught on. And the reason it's so effective is because if you look at those three words, how might we, it's basically, it's about how can we figure out possibilities together. And that middle word, might, is really important there, because if you say, how should we, or how can we, it adds an element of judgment into it. But if you say, how might we, it opens up the question, gee, we might do anything. Anything is possible. So how might we is a really powerful way to, and I urge you to try it at the conference as you're talking with other people about possible solutions to problems, fresh approaches. Think about framing things in how might we language, and you'll see that it's actually really a great way to sort of get the conversation going. Okay, so I have thrown, by the way, this is called, when you're working on questioning together, it's referred to as collaborative inquiry. And collaborative inquiry is where the real magic happens, because all those innovations I talked about that started with somebody asking why, well, they didn't end with that person alone. They happened because that person who asked why joined with other people, and he or she got other people to work on the question together. And when they did that, when they all worked on the question together, they were engaging in collaborative inquiry. And this is really, really powerful. When I go around to companies, I say to them, try to do collaborative inquiry. Make your company all about the idea that all of us together are pursuing questions. We're pursuing the same questions, and we're trying to get the answers together. When you do that, you create basically what I refer to as a mission question, and you can rally people around the same mission question. And mission questions often begin with how might we, How might we as an organization find a way to do this, a way to do that, a way to tackle this challenge? When you frame it this way, you get people on the same page, you get people working on it together. One of the things I say to companies these days when I go, I was doing this with Starbucks recently, is that I think you should get rid of your mission statement and replace it with a mission question. Because a mission question is so much more powerful than a mission statement, you know? And what I mean by that is, like, let's say you're talking about a robotics company, you know, and their statement might be, you know, something like, we make the world a better place through robotics, which, you know, kind of sounds like a slogan or something, and it kind of doesn't really give people much to work with. But think about what happens if you put how might we in front of that, and you say, how might we make the world a better place through robotics? You've changed the entire tone. Now it's open-ended. Now it's more like a mission than a statement. And it's also inviting. It invites people to be part of answering that question. How might we achieve this mission? So I'm a big believer in get rid of mission statements and change them all to mission questions. Okay, by the way, I'm not necessarily getting companies to agree to this because they're kind of invested in their mission statements. They also worry that if they change from a mission statement to a mission question, it will seem like they're less sure of themselves, and they're nervous about that. But anyway, I'm still out there making the case for it, and some people are considering it. So anyway, now I've thrown a lot of stuff at you here very quickly, and so what I want to suggest is that if you want to go deeper on any of this, there are some resources and takeaways. I've put them together on a resource website for you that I created for this group. Okay, and so some of the things you'll find are on here are, and by the way, if you have your iPhone, you know, you might want to take a picture of that URL at the bottom of the screen. That's where you will find all of these resources that you can use to go deeper on any of these points. You'll find out how to do question storming exercises. Someone said to me, don't use Q storming. I forgot to change that. He said, it sounds too much like January 6th or something. So I'm sorry about that. But question storming exercises are all about brainstorming. And so you can find out how to do that exercise. You can find out how to use how might we questions more effectively. You'll learn a little more about the why, what, if, how cycle of questioning and how that works. And there are tips on how not to be a question jerk and all kinds of stuff like that. So definitely look for that resource page. Here is my contact info if you want to get in touch with me about anything, any questions, anything you might have. Just feel free to drop me a line. That website, amorebeautifulquestion.com, is just a clearinghouse of stuff on questioning. You'll find articles, you'll find all kinds of good stuff there. And those are my 2 books, which if you want to read my books, you're welcome to it. That is about it. However, what would a session from a questionologist be if I didn't ask at the end if there were any questions? And I recognize the fact that it can be difficult to ask questions in a group, so I'm going to offer a prize to the first we'll do 2 questions, the first 2 questions that I call on. The prize will be a signed book, which I can get to you if you give your info to the conference organizers. I'll arrange to mail you a signed book. So I'm just going to pick whose hand went up first? Hers. Great. Okay. And we'll do one more after that. I think that's all we have time for.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us instruction on how to ask a good question. I wondered if you had any tips on how to inspire more questions from an inclusivity and an engagement perspective. As we go into more panels, how do we inspire more questions to come to us?
Oh, how do we inspire more questions? Well, one of the things you do is just invite people to ask questions. It's really important. And you can do that early in your session or any presentation you're doing. You notice when I did this, I took questions in the middle, and then I said I'll also take questions at the end. So you're sort of preparing people, and that gives them a chance to think in their heads if they have a question, and that's really good to do. Otherwise, if you wait till the end and you just say any questions at the end, sometimes they're not ready, and so they haven't had time to think of it. So that's one thing that's one tip you can do. And just in general, how do you invite questions? I think one of the things I say to teachers is a great thing that teachers can do is they can withhold information. So don't tell the kids everything. Leave some key information out, and that will sometimes inspire them to ask questions about it. So yeah, I will do one more question. I'm going to just randomly pick. Okay, right here. No, right here.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. My question is, you mentioned that fear is one of the factors that people don't ask questions. How we can overcome that fear, or if you're the one who's going to being asked that question, how we can encourage people to overcome that fear?
I think what I feel is the best way to overcome the fear of questioning is to do what you just did, which is to ask a question in front of other people. A lot of this is simply practice. It's simply getting used to being willing to ask a question, and then you tend to get more and more comfortable with it. Another thing you can do if you're trying to, let's say you're a manager or a leader of an organization and you want people asking more questions, think about breaking people up into smaller groups and then encourage questioning within smaller groups. That exercise I pointed to earlier with the students doing question storming, one of the reasons that works is because you break the kids up into groups of 4 or 6. They don't have to ask a question in front of the whole classroom. So I say the same thing to managers and people who might have a big boardroom, and they say to me, we have a big meeting with all the employees or whatever, and at the end I ask any questions, and nobody asks any questions. And so one of the things I say is, well, don't force them to do it in front of the whole group. Think about creating smaller groups and then encouraging questioning within smaller groups. That gets people a little more comfortable. So I think there are going to be some final instructions from Jeff, but that's it for me, and I want to thank you all for listening and for asking questions, and stay curious. Thank you.